Hey, what's up, guys? I'm going to try my best to do this in one take without any editing, or at least minimal editing, so just go ahead and give it a shot. Today we're going to be covering the Tranquilizer by M3 Metal Creations. So as I usually do, I'll start off with the introduction, which includes a bit of background and some first impressions about the spinner. So M3 Metal Creations is run by a guy named Michael Morris, and he's a pretty cool dude. You might recall seeing him on the Weekly Spin a couple of times. He has a very spunky personality, and I just really appreciate everything that that he does. He gives off a really good vibe. He posts videos of his shop and the different art that he has going on there, pictures rather, and he posts jam sessions where he's rocking out in his machine shop, and it's just really cool. It's nice to get him to share those kind of things because it makes it a little bit more personal with him in the community and interacting with members. So M3 Metal Creations, you might know them for the Dyad, the Trinity, the Aurora XL, the Trirora, and those spinners. Those were all spinners that were made by another company, a machine shop outside the country, I believe. And I'm not sure how much he was involved, but he was involved in the some of the finishing done on those spinners, but for the most part they were manufactured outside of his machine shop. He kind of only did spinning tops and various knickknacks that he came up with, but for the most part his spinners up until this point have been manufactured outside of the US. This is the first exception to that. This is a spinner that he machines in house, and this one in particular has a stonewash on it. It is a prototype. It's the first prototype, I believe, going by the serial number on the side. So being new to the kind of machining game, and this being his first production run where he's actually doing a full production of spinners out of his own machine shop, he has a new CNC, and he detailed the entire journey along the way of getting that all set up, programmed, and everything. And it was nice that he shared that journey with us, because we got to see from the first spinner that he created to the first protos that he was creating, and we're going to be able to see how he's going to do on this upcoming run. Yeah, my first impressions of the spinner was I gave it a spin, and the bearing is pretty rough. That's just I don't know if it's sitting in there not quite at the right position, so there is a fair amount of judder. It's also a little gritty. I did swap out the bearing, but I'm going to be sending this back to Mike, so I wanted to swap it back and keep it the way put it back to the way that he sent it to me, so so that he receives it in the same configuration. When I first spun this, other than the imperfections that you can kind of see, let's try to get this on the camera. There's like and excuse the ripped glove. There's kind of like some imperfect machining going on right here on the side. There's some scratches or dings. I'm not really sure what to make of them. Yeah, there's another ding, and the buttons came with this reddish ding. I'm not sure what that's from, but the finish is really nice. But other than those imperfections, when I first spun it, I was kind of underwhelmed. It doesn't look like much, to be honest. It looks very simple, but as I kind of spent some time with it, I found that it's it really grows on you. there's beauty in simplicity, and that's definitely the case with this spinner. So I kind of realized that it was just solid as is, and that's kind of where I stand now, and I think I'm going to need one of these. As in my one review that I have under my belt, I'm going to go over the positive for the experience, the ergonomics, and the quality, and then I'll go over the negatives in those three categories, and I'll finish up with some closing thoughts to give you guys a pretty good idea of where I stand with this spinner. So, experience-wise, the spinner is very small. It's very thick though, so it's pretty hefty. It feels substantial in your hand, and it doesn't make you feel like it's too light, or there's just not enough there to really feel like it's an actual spinner. You know, some spinners that are just so small and light, they just don't feel like spinners. Yeah, I don't know how to explain it other than that, but that's just kind of the sense that I get. It is I'll say elegantly simple. It's very simplistic. There's some chamfers around the edges. It's a pill shape. It's rounded around the edges. It's got some engraving, cutouts for the buttons. The buttons kind of recess into the body a little bit. But other than that, there's not much else to it. It's not so feature-rich spinner, but we've seen a lot of spinners see success with that, and so it doesn't necessarily need to be complex to be a really good spinner, and that's how I feel about this one. The appearance of the finish that he's done on this, it's a stonewash, as I mentioned. It's a pretty nice stonewash. It's very smooth to touch. The tops, or the flats, are you can kind of see like a kind of glittery type appearance, which is kind of standard for stonewashing, depending on the media and how you do it. This one is it's very smooth, but it also has that kind of chalky texture to it, if that makes sense. Some of the other, like Tom's stonewash finish, his polished stonewash, for instance, it's very, it's of course polished, so it has a lot smoother feel. It's a lot glassier feeling. Even his regular stonewash, fine stonewash, it feels very, very smooth. This one is also smooth, but it does have a little bit more of a chalky texture. And that's something that I've noticed with some of the spinners that I've also stonewashed myself. I have a tumbler downstairs that I've used on a few spinners, and I like the results, but they kind of vary a little bit, and take some getting used to. The other finish that it comes in is machine finish, and it's very reflective. As you've seen in some of the pictures, I'll probably put up some pictures here to give you some examples of that. It's really something to appreciate with this design because of all of the blank faces that he's kind of created, and it makes for some really nice machining lines if you pay attention to that sort of thing as a machinist. And he definitely has, and I think it looks really good. I would be concerned about how the edges will feel, though. With the stonewash finish, they are softened, so they're not as pronounced, and they feel really nice. But I'm not sure how the machine finish will feel. It'll be interesting to see what people think about that. So it's a very basic pill shape. The chamfers do add a nice transition from the flats to the sides, which is, feels great in hand. It's nice to see the branding finally on his spinners. He hasn't really had any branding, just some serial numbers under the buttons, but it's the first time that he's put some branding on some spinners, I believe. And I really like this logo that he's come up with. It's very simple, but it does the job, and it looks nice. On to ergonomics. Spinner is very curvy, and that means it's very comfortable. The sides are, the ends rather, are very rounded off, and that's very nice to feel in hand. It's very easy to handle. The buttons are, they're dished. These are just Coliseum. I think these are 19s, I want to say. And I think they fit the spinner somewhat well. I'll get into some of my other reserved thoughts on them as we go through this review, but it does make it the spinner easy to handle, and that's a good thing. The chamfers on the side, as I mentioned with the experience, they not only look good, they also feel good to your fingers, and it's not as sudden of an edge from the flats to the sides. So that's also nice. It's also a plus. Overall, the spinner gives you a very solid spinning experience. I know this bearing is very gritty, but when I had the other bearing in there, I probably should have left it in here for the review at least. But it's a very solid spinning experience, and it's pretty addictive actually. Also something I wanted to call out is the angle. The chamfers are really nice. Usually I believe that you see them a little bit more angled. Maybe you can look at the machinima thing. Appears to be the same angle, I think. Yeah, I don't know if that comes through. They're very much smaller than these chamfers, but looks to be about the same angle wise. So maybe it's not so different. Maybe it just looks different because it is more pronounced because it is a bigger chamfer. But they are nice nonetheless, and I really like the angle that he's chosen here. And rather than making it more like that, he's made it more horizontal than vertical. Yeah. So on to the quality. The engraving is pretty top notch. I'm not sure if I think he does this, he sends this out to get engraved. I get that sense because looking at some of the store pages for the drop tomorrow, September 14th, some of the pages say, oh, it still needs to be sent out for engraving. So I don't believe he does this in-house. It is very nice, though, so I did want to draw attention to that. The machining on the spinner is pretty good for the most part. I did want to call attention to the ends, though. You can kind of see how it's rounded, but you can kind of see some of the angles in the ends. Yeah, I'm not sure what to... It almost reminds me of like a piece of wood that's been cut. You kind of see those the transition of those facets rather than a completely rounded edge, if that makes sense. But yeah, so those are there. You can see them if that bugs you. That's something to consider. They don't bug me. They're not really that noticeable anyways, especially with the stonewash. I'm not sure if it'll be the same case for the other iterations for the production run, but I guess we'll see. It's a pretty decent finish. Like I said, it does have that chalkiness to it, so I think there is some improvement to be made. I think he's still pretty new to stonewashing in general. So it's to be expected for the first production run, especially to have that leave some room for improvement. It's you kind of expect there to be some less than perfect elements, and the stonewash isn't perfect. But it is getting better, I think. Some of the early pieces that he stonewashed, they looked a little rough. I experienced the same thing coming up with my my stonewash ability, or my ability to stonewash spinners, if that makes sense. So I can understand, where he's coming from with that. It is a learning experience. We can't all be Tom with a perfect prescriptive manual of, all the different media and the different amounts to add for a particular finish, and have it that granular to where you can just reproduce it consistently. But I do see improvement. This finish is a pretty good stonewash. It's not. I wouldn't say it's bad, but there are inconsistencies. I don't know if you can see that, but it's kind of like the outer part of the arms. You can see that it's darker than the inside, and that's from where the media hit mostly here, and not so much, but like less towards the center. But yeah, so that's the quality. I also wanted to mention that it is pretty well balanced. I know it doesn't really seem that way here. You can see it wobbling. That is because the placement of the bearing. I think I didn't get it quite center when I put it back in or something. It is a little finicky. But when it did come to me, and when I put the other bearing in there, it was very well balanced, and you could balance it on one finger. I could still balance it on one finger, but you can feel that judder. If you take the spinner at face value, it kind of leaves a little bit to be desired. But you can definitely see this as an instant classic. And 2 years ago, this would have been a very successful design. Nowadays, I think it still will be a very successful design. I think that some of the simpler designs still do very well, but the design feels very 2 years ago rather than something that's coming out nowadays. And maybe that's just a testament to how adventurous makers have become nowadays. So I realized that I didn't really do a comparison to these spinners. I meant to do that in the beginning, but we'll go ahead and do that now. So I got out the machinima thing. I sold my spinima thing, so that's what I have. This is one that that the community kind of brought up as a very similar design, and you could see some of the similar elements. I think there were even some people who were saying that this was a ripoff of this. I don't feel that way. They definitely can coexist. They have their similarities, of course, but I don't think that it was Mike's intent to look at this spinner and say, hey, I'm gonna make, I see this as being really successful, so I'm gonna make my version of it, and coming out with the Tranquilizer. I don't think that's the case. So yeah, and they really can't be more different. They have a similar look to them, similar profile, and but they are very different. The spinima thing and the machinima thing, they haven't been done small yet. They've been done shorter, but not smaller. So this feels new. It doesn't feel very much like another iteration of the spinima thing or the machinima thing. So there's that one. Another one I brought out was the Chunk by Stealth Spinners. This one I seen is kind of similar in shape. All of these are kind of similar in shape. Not much similar about these two other than maybe the look, but I mean, it's a very simple type of design and shape, so you can't really fault it for that. Another one is the Joyride. This one is kind of like, I see this as the 3D bloopy version of this, and you can see that they're very similar in shape, or at least general appearance, other than the fact that this is very much rounded and this is more chamfered in angles and flats. But yeah, they are somewhat similar. And finally, we have the Xanax spinner, or the bar spinner from FTO. This one I just kind of brought out just because It looks kind of similar, I guess, but again, you know, they couldn't be more different. So there's a kind of a size comparison for you with those 5 spinners. Yeah, so very similar in size, not really thick, but lengthwise, save for the Xanax spinner, which is a little bit longer. So let's get those out of the way. So I'll go ahead and move on to the negative at this point, and we'll see how that goes. So experience-wise, as I said, you know, it's very small, and at the end of the day, that is a make or break for some people. Some people love smaller spinners like Brittany King, but some people hate smaller spinners. Aaron Carroll, for instance, doesn't like smaller spinners. But he does have one of these, and he said that he does like the that, you know, he's able to spin something different, not just copper, but also the size, I think. So maybe he doesn't hate them as much as he thinks. Also experience-wise, the spinner kind of makes me feel like there's some untapped potential here. You're kind of teased with these flat surfaces, and that's mostly probably because when he first came out with this, he showed so many different versions that he came up with, and he'll be dropping all the different versions tomorrow, I believe. But that's something that I did notice, and I really took a particular liking to the ones that had the milled out, like, scoopy bits. There was like 3 in each arm, and that one looked really good to me, and I wanted to see more of those. It doesn't look like he's going to be doing those in the production run. It looks like it's just going to be the machine finish and the polished in either the medium chamfers or the angled chamfers, which is the ones with slightly what's it called? A graduated chamfer that gets bigger as you get to the end. And I think that's the one that Chris Pena has, and he'll be doing a review on it as well. So anyways, it feels like there's just something missing for me, and it's probably because of that confirmation bias. You know, I seen those versions, so I wanted that, and yeah, this is kind of not that. But you know, it's not meant to be all that complex, but I do feel like I'm settling with the simplicity that this one has. If I were to own this one, that's kind of how I'd feel. But you know, at the same time, you know, all the positives hold true, and I don't feel like this is a bad spinner at the end of the day. There's another thing is there's not a whole lot of value that I see in this spinner. It's a very nice spinner, don't get me wrong, but what I see, and this is kind of a relative measure, you see a lot more value being put out by spinner companies that are not in the US. And I'm not trying to be negative. I'm not trying to be, you know, knock the American makers, but it is a feeling that I feel inside, and I have to be honest with myself. That's kind of where I'm at internally, is feeling like, you know, I really like more value in the spinner, and something as simplistic as this. I don't feel super satisfied with what I'm getting for the cost, and yeah, that's just my feeling. I know that this one is going to do well. I do think it's a very solid spinner. I'm still gonna pay that top dollar, you know, for the spinner, but it does kind of leave that sense lingering inside me. But yeah, yeah. So another spinner that's kind of similar to this is the Zen Duo Nano, which is the bar that Fidget HQ came out with, and it's very similar to this spinner in a few ways, and that one's like, you know, about a third of the price. And yeah, that's kind of why I arrived at that feeling. Is, you know, there are so many other spinners that there are a lot of value. There's a lot of value to be seen in those spinners, and really felt. Even his other spinners that he came out with, the Aurora and the Dyad and Trinity, those were a little cheaper, and they were still, you know, that you felt like you were getting a lot for your money. And I don't feel the same way about this spinner, and you know, that's just me being honest. So we'll get off that note. The next category is ergonomics, the bad. So the buttons are the main gripe for me, for ergonomics. I did mention that they are deep dished, so they do feel nice, but they're kind of unfitting for my taste. I've never really liked the Coliseum buttons. I think that's what these are called. I think there were two versions. One was like with graduated steps, but also with the carvings, and it had like 3 rings to it. These ones have 2 rings to them. I don't know if they're called the same thing. I think they are, but they're just never really my thing. They felt kind of clunky, and they look nice. That you can see the bearing and stuff, but just not my taste. And that's just, you know, how I feel about it. I'm left feeling like it needs proper buttons. And he didn't have another some alternative buttons that he made himself, handmade, and those seem to fit the spinner a little bit better rather. But yeah, this version doesn't have those. And you know, I found another pair of buttons, the Focus V2 buttons, which you know, I'll put a picture up. And those feel a little bit better to me, but you know, I found myself missing that dish, so I did end up putting these back on and enjoying the spinner that way, with these buttons on them. They're kind of a little, you know, slightly too tall. I would like them just a little bit shorter, but you know, these are just minor gripes. It's just me kind of being whiny at this point. I do wish the chamfers were a little bit more pronounced on the spinner body. You know, on the other versions you see that there's a little bit of a larger chamfer, so maybe it's better that for me to go for one of the versions that have the larger chamfers, and maybe I'll be a little bit more happy. But these are nice, but I am left wanting more, like I said. It is a small spinner, so the handling it's pretty good if you get the right buttons on it, but it is small, and some people, you know, with bigger hands, it hasn't really been an issue for me, thankfully. I definitely wouldn't want to drop and ding it, although I did receive it with a few dings. It is prone to dropping, I think, if you're not careful, so something to be mindful of. Onto the quality. The first run of a spinner means that there are going to be imperfections, and that's definitely the case with this prototype. I'm hoping that most of the issues will be ironed out with the production run, and I'm pretty sure that that'll be the case. You know, it's something that it's a skill that you develop as a machinist, that you just get better and better, so I'm sure that we won't see the same issues with some of the prototypes that I've seen with the production run. Another thing, and this is kind of a tough one to say, because I don't want Mike to get the wrong idea, or anybody else to get the wrong idea, but it is worth mentioning that the machining that I've been seeing coming out of the machine shop at M3 Metal Creations, if I'm being completely honest, it's not up to the same standards as one of the other more prominent machine shops, like Modus Works or FTO, or you know, something similar. And we have to give him some slack. I'm not saying that you're a bad machinist, Mike. I do think that there's a lot of room for improvement, though, and that's just me being honest. I always want to strive to be better myself, and I really like to give people feedback that's meaningful to them so that they can improve themselves as well. And that's my attempt at telling you, hey, this is something that exists, so maybe that's something that you keep in mind moving forward, just to make sure that, and I'm sure that you're already paying attention to it, but something that you are working to improve and hone your skills on. And you can kind of see some of that here on the side, but on some of the handmade buttons, and it is handmade buttons. He's making them on his lathe. You see those like little ripples of machine lines, and yeah, it doesn't look fantastic. But sometimes that's the price you pay for handmade, and that's okay. So okay, now we're past that. There are imperfections. This is we are talking about quality, so I did want to mention the imperfections again. But again, it is a proto, and this isn't the production run. Hopefully, he'll figure some things out with machining and with finishing to make sure that these things don't show up in the production run. But it is something to be mindful of. Even if this is a prototype, it's still good to call it out just so that it's on the table and he's aware. The other thing is, as I mentioned, the finish could be a lot smoother for me. It does have that chalky texture, so just another thing to keep in mind. The buttons, as I mentioned, they're not really my thing, but really, if you look at them relative to the spinner body, they do kind of look like an afterthought. And yeah, that's just kind of how I feel about them. The other buttons that are handmade, they don't feel the same way, or I don't feel the same way about them. They do seem to fit the spinner a lot more. So maybe that's a point for those buttons. Moving forward with those rather than the Colosseums. I know that some people do like these buttons, probably most people, but they aren't my thing, so I would prefer those handmade buttons, or some variation of those that are sustainable to make over time. Excuse me. Yeah, so those are the positives and the negatives in those three categories. So I'll move on to the closing thoughts. So the first thing and most important thing to keep in mind is that this is a prototype. It's not a production spinner. So all of the things that I've mentioned, they can be improved, in the production run, if Mike pays attention to those and he's kind of worked on those areas, and I'm sure he will. I'm sure we won't see a lot of the things that I'm seeing with this as negatives. So it's just something to keep in mind through this whole review. Another thing is this is similar to this or this or this, and that's something that I don't agree with. I know that when people seen this design, they just saw Modus Works, and I have to admit that the serial being on the side does seem a little bit Modus Worksy, if that makes sense. But at the same time, we have to realize that this isn't like a copyrighted thing. It's not. This is something that other makers should be able to do. It shouldn't be the case where just because Jonas puts his serial numbers on the side, and these are laser engraved on the side, we can't just cry Modus Works. There are similarities, like I mentioned. So. I do understand that position, but at the same time, I do think it's different. It's way different from the machinima thing, the spinima thing, and such. And I don't feel like this is a ripoff. So that's just how I feel. The other thing is this is the first CNC run of spinners made in house by M3. So yeah, it's just something to keep in mind. There's nothing, I'm not saying that it's going to be lower quality. It is going to be different from what the other spinners that he's put out under that brand have been, because you know, he's using his own machine shop rather than some external machine shop. So there is some difference going to be prevalent there, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. And I'm definitely not saying that it's a bad thing. The last thing, or second to last thing that I wanted to mention was, it doesn't really feel like a substantial spinner, and this is something that I mentioned in the one of the other sections. I forget. The experience. It's not really a substantial spinner in its own right. I did say that earlier that it does feel like a spinner of substance, because it does have the weight to back the size. But at the end of the day, it doesn't feel like a substantial spinner. So because it's small, because it's, you know, yeah, I guess it's not that small, you know, relative to these other spinners, but it is small relative to spinners in general, and that does leave me feeling that the cost just really isn't justified for me. You know, but like I said, you know, I'm kind of a hypocrite because I would still pay the price. So take with that what you will. And yeah, at the end of the day, these machine shops can charge what they want for spinners. And if people are willing to pay pay that price, me included, they will continue to ask those prices, and you know, we'll get more spinners out of them, and so forth. So yeah, I think I've said enough on that. This is a solid first go at a spinner for M3. Moving kind of moving away from the aesthetics of both the Dyad Trinity line and the Aurora line. This is very different, and it is a pretty solid first go. It is very simple, but I think that this is the perfect spinner for Mike to get started on, and to really establish some a good feel for how to handle his machines, and get a feel for how to work with them and make things work smoothly. So I do see this as a stepping stone to greater things, and I do hope that Mike kind of ventures away from this simple design to do some of the other crazy things that are probably on his mind. He does seem to have a very creative imagination, so I'll be really interested to see kind of what he's able to do moving forward. Yeah, that's the last point that I had isn't really relevant, so we'll leave it at that. That's all I had for this review. We're at 40 minutes now, so that's a little bit long for a review. So that was the review for the Tranquilizer for M3. As I mentioned, they're going to be having a drop tomorrow. I forget what time. I'll put it there. So yeah, be on the lookout for that, and I'll be interested to see what else Mike has in store for us in the future. Anyways, I think I've talked way too much. My throat is really dry at this point. Hopefully you guys can still understand me. So until next time, I have been Nate, and it's been a pleasure. Until next time, take care, Spin Fam.